Hello. Thank you so much all for being here. This is amazing, and there is no city I'd rather be in right now. Dublin's long been one of my favorite places, and particularly when talking about partition, I think it's a particularly important place to be giving this talk. Let me just see if this works. So I'd like to begin my talk today with this map here. When I was in school, there was this myth going around that you could see the Great Wall of China from space. But it is just that, a myth. And if you were to sit on the International Space Station and squint your eyes as hard as you could, you wouldn't be able to see a thing. And in fact, there's only one wall in the world that you can see from space, and that is the India-Pakistan border that runs for about 3,000 kilometers from the Arabian Sea north through the deserts of Punjab, the deserts of Rajasthan, the plains of Punjab, all the way north to the high Himalayan mountain range, just a few kilometers away from K2, the second tallest mountain on planet Earth. This is one of the most militarized borders in the world, with armies with nuclear arsenals on either side, with these nuclear weapons pointed at one another. India and Pakistan are arch rivals. And this is just one of numerous incredibly fortified borders in the region. If you were to go further east to the India-Bangladesh border, you actually have the longest border fence in the world. Further east than that, the India-Burma, Myanmar border is actually the largest border wall in construction, beating even the US-Mexico border that's perhaps more in the news. And what I think is extraordinary is that 100 years ago today, not a single one of these borders existed or was even foreseen. If you were to go back 100 years ago today, the British Empire was at its peak and was so confident that if you were to go to the erstwhile capital of Calcutta, you would see the recently inaugurated Victoria Memorial, built in honor of Queen Victoria in the style of St. Paul's Cathedral, but in the same marble as the Taj Mahal, to kind of show in stone that Britain had superseded the Mughal Empire as the new rulers of the subcontinent. If you were to go a bit further west along the Gangetic Plains, you would reach Delhi, which was 100 years ago today, witness to perhaps the largest architectural project ever attempted by the British Empire. The building of Lutyens' Delhi was intended, like Rome, to be built for eternity, was the line. And Edwin Lutyens, who was put in charge of designing the place, had previously been known for kind of designing nice British country houses across kind of, Suffolk and Essex, etc. And suddenly was put in charge of one of the largest, most incredible architectural projects ever conceived by mankind. And if you've been to Delhi today, you'll know that there are just hundreds of these kind of Art Deco palaces, with colonial houses stretching as far as the eye can see, everything from the President's House, Rashtrapati Bhavan, to the Gymkhana Club, all of these amazing old palaces that once belonged to the erstwhile aristocracy. Now, when I set out about 5 years ago to write a book about the breakup of the Raj and the emergence of the borders in the region, I immediately set out to look for what in Delhi, in my childhood in Delhi, was always renowned as one of the most famous moments in the march towards independence. And this was the declaration in 1928 that the Indian National Congress, the largest political party in the country, demanded complete national independence. Here it is. What's perhaps surprising is the fact that on the day, it's actually the kind of bottom right-hand corner of the newspaper. The British Empire, again, at this point, is so confident of its future success, of its continued expansion, that actually the #1 story that day was the British Empire is planning to expand into space. And so the BBC, launched 2 years earlier, sends out a message saying, "Hello, all stars and nebulae, a greeting to all friendly planets that circle with us on the everlasting tour. Do our waves reach you yet?" After which there's a kind of awkward pause as they wait for some aliens to get back in touch. About 5 minutes later, they realize that no one's getting in touch, and so they turn to address the British Empire, which is 4/5 at this point made up of the Indian people. And this is the crucial thing, because India at this moment is not the India that we know today. It's much, much larger. And there's no better object to show this than this passport. This passport is an Indian Empire passport, issued in the mid-1920s, I think. And this particular passport is issued to a Yemeni Jewish woman who, after the Balfour Declaration, has declared the Holy Land as a homeland for the Jewish peoples. She's trying to migrate to mandate Palestine. Now, to do that, she has to go on an Indian passport because legally, anyone born in South Yemen is Indian, because South Yemen is part of India. Here it is. She is born in the city of Aden, which is now in South Yemen. About 1/3 of British India, or the Raj as it was more commonly known, was made up of these semi-independent princely states, the Maharajas, Nawabs, Sultans, Sheikhs, you have it. And if any of you have been to India, you may have been to Jaipur, where there's a lovely Maharaja's palace, Jodhpur, the Blue City, another Maharaja's palace, or Kashmir, Hyderabad. In Pakistan, you've got Bhavalpur. These are all princely states, these semi-independent kingdoms that had handed over authority over their borders, their foreign policy and their defense to the British, but were internally independent. And again, all of these places were legally constituted part of British India. What's extraordinary is that alphabetically, the first on the old list of princely states, alphabetically, is Abu Dhabi, not a state that you normally associate with India. And once again, in the old Indian darbars, where all of the Indian royalty have to pledge their allegiance to the British crown, you have Maharajas in what's now India, but you also have sultans from eastern Yemen and a bunch of Maharajas from what's now Burma. So evidently, India was larger than it is today by quite some extent. In fact, if you go back 100 years ago today, this is the map of India that would greet you. It's far larger than we tend to imagine, stretching from what's now Aden, what's now Yemen, just across the Red Sea from Africa, all the way to Burma and the borders of Thailand. The story I'm going to be telling you in the next 50 minutes or so is the story of how this one enormous super colony was carved out by 5 partitions into, over 5 decades into 12 modern nation states: Yemen, Oman, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Myanmar. The story of the partition of India is so much larger than we think, and with each partition, new conflicts would emerge that continue to forge the world that we see today. Everything from the Kashmir crisis, which only this April brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, but also the Rohingya genocide, secessionist movements in Balochistan and northeast India, the Gulf War with Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, all of these, and indeed the civil war in Yemen, all of these have their origins in these 5 decades. And by understanding how the Raj fragmented, you get a much better grounding, I guess, in the geopolitics of modern Asia, and the conflicts that continue to shape a quarter of the world's population, because the crucial thing to understand is that the British colony of India constituted at the time a quarter of the world's population. It had the largest Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, and Zoroastrian populations on the planet. And its breakup, arguably, is one of the most significant events of the 20th century, and one which should be understood alongside, the great events of the 20th century like World War II, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's shocking that we don't know this stuff. The first discussions about partitioning the Indian Empire occur in its richest and largest province of Burma, which was then its easternmost province. And today, just this March, I was in Yangon, erstwhile Rangoon, which was its capital in the colonial period. And within just a few minutes' walk, you can go past one of the most amazing Buddhist pagodas in the world, walk past the largest synagogue in Southeast Asia, through the Tamil Hindu bazaar, past the Chola Dargah, the Sufi shrine, and end up at an Armenian church that's actually from the 1670s. And the reason for this incredible diversity was that, in a way that we've kind of forgotten today, Burma was right at the heart of the economy of the world in the 1920s. It's since gone into isolationism and military dictatorship and civil war, which has completely removed it from the central place in world politics that it had in the 1920s. Rangoon in 1933, it was reported, had overtaken New York City as the greatest immigration and emigration port in the world. So in a sense, the Burmese dream had overtaken the American dream. And yet, in a way somewhat like Brexit, mass immigration split the province down the middle. You have, on the one hand, a group of people called the separationists that demanded that Burma be made into a separate British colony, not independence from Britain, but a separate British colony. And these people said that immigration was pushing indigenous Burmese people out of the capital of Rangoon and other major colonial cities. No one could afford anywhere to live anymore. On the other hand, you have a group of people saying that this is making us incredibly rich, our society is becoming much more diverse and much more culturally rich. This is an article from the Scotsman newspaper, which I think fascinatingly shows just how inconceivable to so many people an India without Burma was. It says that this attitude towards the separation question is indeed one which strikes deep into the very existence of India itself as an entity. If one province breaks loose, no reason can be shown why similar claims by others should not be granted. And you can see in the politics of the time, the largest politician, in a sense, in the country is this guy, Mahatma Ottama. And he pegs the latter half of his political career on trying to persuade people that Burma is an integral part of Indian civilization. Whereas actually Mahatma Gandhi, who used to campaign in Burma just like any other province of India, is dead set on the idea that it wasn't part of Indian civilization. And his reasoning is that the future Indian nation state that he wants to create is one that resembles the geography of the ancient Hindu epic, the Mahabharata. And this is the rough kind of nation that he wanted to forge: India, Pakistan, Bhutan, Nepal, and Bangladesh, but not Burma and not the Arabian states. So a kind of Hindu sacred geography, if you will. A lot of things happen, including the unexpected appearance of a revolution led by the IRA, the Indian Republican Army, which happens on Easter 1930 by a bunch of Sinn Féin activists in Bengal. It's utterly bizarre. And then the Wall Street crash happens, where a bunch of Indian bankers seize land from Burmese farmers as a result of people defaulting on their debts. And ultimately, on April Fool's Day 1937, the first partition of India carves its way through the landscape. And these are the stamps that were issued that day. You can see a crack separating the Taj Mahal from all the Burmese pagodas. And in some ways, this hints at the social alienation that's soon to come. In the wake of separation, a bunch of virulently anti-immigration politicians take over the country and begin trying to define who is Burmese and who isn't. trying to expel those that they don't consider Burmese enough. Notably, this includes a certain ethnic group called the Rohingya, who are labeled as Indians who need to be pushed into India. And by the time that World War II reaches the region, the Japanese, after Pearl Harbor, begin pushing through Southeast Asia towards Burma, the Indian population is so fearful of their lives that they flee en masse when the British pull out. So in 1941, I think, no, 1942, you see 366,000 Indians flee for their lives through the jungles. And this photograph I found in an attic in North London. This little boy on the bottom left-hand corner would later be the first Sikh model for Moss, the clothing company. But this is from when he and his family were forced to flee Burma on foot through the jungle. And his father, Uttam Singh, this lovely man over here, kept a diary of their exile. And it's extraordinary. It reads like a kind of Sikh version of Apocalypse Now, as 40 Sikh families take a raft up the Chindwin River trying to get through to the Indian border, with the Brits having upped and left overnight and not offered any means for these people to get back to India. So, you know, whilst they're sailing up this river, some people are being taken away by leopards. There's British and Japanese dogfights overhead, and it's this extraordinary forgotten story, which was at the time one of the largest refugee crises ever recorded. Now, at roughly the same time as Burma is separated off from India, there are increasing demands for the separation of this region, the Gulf states. And of all the bits of this book that I think have generated the most press, it's the story of how the Gulf used to be a part of the Raj. They were added on to the Raj in some sense the last, and they were Indianized the least, if that makes sense. They were integrated into the British imperial system of India for the least amount of time. But you see legacies of this connection in the fact that, for example, the Sultans of Oman in the mid-1900s were still more fluent in Urdu, an Indian language, than Arabic. And the entire Omani army operated in Urdu rather than Arabic until, I think, the kind of 1950s or something ridiculous. All of the aristocracy from the region all went to school in Mayo College, Rajasthan, in India, rather than anywhere in the Arabian Peninsula. And if you look at the old mode of dress in the Arabian Peninsula, it was not the sort of outfits that we see them wearing today with the kind of thobe and the Saudi-style turban. It looks much more Indian. These are all the sultans of eastern Yemen in the 1940s. And as you can see, they're all relatives of the Nizam of Hyderabad, the main ruler of central India. These are all the Yemeni princes, and this is the Nizam of Hyderabad, who was at the time, I think after the death of J.D. Rockefeller, was the richest man in the world, and Hyderabad in central India was regarded as one of the great centers of Islamic learning outside of the Arabic-speaking world. Now, the reason that this section of the book generated the most press is because of this rather unexpected way that this region separated off from India. There is a note in the British archives that you can find of the legation from Tehran who were put in charge of figuring out the fate of this region after the British depart. And they essentially offer it to the future government of India. They say, do you want, you could integrate this if you like. And there's a quote from the legation of Tehran that says it was with surprising unanimity that the government of India officials said that the Persian Gulf states were of absolutely no interest to them. This was a time before oil was discovered, and this was Dubai at the time, a bit different from Dubai now. And so it was shaved off from the Indian Empire and put under the purview of Whitehall rather than the Viceroy of India. What this means is that once India gained independence, these states were no longer under the Viceroy's purview and so were not inherited by the future government of India. But there is an unexpected possibility that you read about where the entire region of the GCC states and the entire united oil wealth of Abu Dhabi, Qatar, Kuwait, etc., were all inherited by either India or Pakistan. It's extraordinary to think about. And we have legacies, again, of this former connection. The man on the right here is Mr. Kimji, who is the only Hindu sheikh in the Arab world. In Oman, his community, the Banya community, are recognized as an indigenous tribe of Oman, and he is the sheikh of the Banya community. Meanwhile, this man is Dhirubhai Ambani, whose grandson recently had that extraordinary wedding that you may have seen in the press last year, that hugely opulent wedding where every single celebrity in Europe and the US seemed to be invited. You had Bill Gates showing up, etc. They get their money because in the 1960s, when the Indian community is being pushed out of the Gulf by rising Arab nationalism, Ambani basically makes a point of hiring every single Indian who's kicked out of this region. And here, there are all these Indians who are trained in free market capitalism rather than the Nehruvian socialism that was kind of prevalent at the time in India. And so in one fell swoop, he snatches up all of the greatest businessmen in the Gulf and founds what is today, I think, the largest and richest company in Asia. So these two events, the Partition of Burma and the Partition of Arabia, could have been the central events of modern South Asian history, in a sense. But they were almost completely overshadowed by the scale of what happened next. Because in 1947, August, India would be partitioned along religious lines as the British departed, handing over power to two countries, India and Pakistan, and leaving in their wake a refugee crisis unparalleled in human history. In the course of just 9 months, somewhere between 12 to 15 million people were rendered stateless and fled across the border for the other countries. So Hindus and Sikhs fleeing Pakistan for India, and Muslims fleeing India for Pakistan. Between 1 to 3 million people never make it. So again, this is the central moment for a quarter of the world's population to this day, the prism through which a quarter of the world's population perceives their past, present, and future. It would take forever to get into all of the logistics, and you should buy the book for that. But the gist of the story is that in the wake of World War II, the Brits, it is clear, are about to leave. There's no longer the political will to put down any future rebellions. You know, the army's tired after 6 years of fighting. Britain itself is basically broke. So lights can't be turned on. There's only electricity for a few hours of the day. And so with everything nearing collapse, essentially, it's announced that a transfer of power will take place. Now, the issue is that India had both the largest Hindu population in the world and the largest Muslim population in the world. There were more Muslims in India than the entire Arab world put together in the 1940s. And here you can get a rough sense of these kind of, there are vast areas roughly corresponding to Pakistan and Bangladesh where Muslims were in the majority, but also vast areas where they constituted just under 50% of the population. And so this was an incredibly mixed society. The first demands for the creation of Pakistan happen remarkably late. The first time the word is even used is 1933 in this pamphlet by a Cambridge student, not an Indian politician, by a Cambridge student who writes that why, if Burma is allowed to be separated from the Indian Union, are the Muslims of India to be forced into it? So it's directly inspired by events in Burma just a few years earlier. In August 1946, the demand over the creation of Pakistan turns violent in the streets of Kolkata on a day known as Direct Action Day. Essentially, religious violence begins to break out. And it's at this point that the question over the creation of Pakistan goes from a vague possibility to an incredibly politically charged question. And so in June 1947, the last British Viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, is sent out to India to wrap up the British Raj as quickly as he can. He is given until June 1948 to hand over power, but he decides he's going to try and do it in 77 days. And he announces in June 1947 that he will hand over power to two new dominions, India and Pakistan, on the basis of religious majority or minority in different provinces. So Muslim majority regions will be handed over to the government of Pakistan. Non-Muslim majority regions will be handed over to the government of India. What's extraordinary is how rushed it all is. This is a map from about a month before Independence Day, and it's clear that still no one has any clue where Pakistan will be and where India will be. You can see that in this map, I think it's published by the Hindustan Times in July 1947, they still think that both Delhi, which is there, and Kolkata, which is there, would both become part of Pakistan. That's the general assumption. And no one has any clue what's going to happen to the princely states that are in the kind of checkered pattern, because those were technically not part of British-ruled India. And so the assumption was that after independence, they would resume their prior independence and become new countries. So Kashmir would be a country, Mysore would be a country, Hyderabad would be a country, etc., as would Nepal and Bhutan. And of course, we know that two of them, Nepal and Bhutan, would become new countries, but the rest would not. In the wake of this decision by Mountbatten, the craziest bureaucratic nightmare that could ever have possibly been dreamed up by Kafka begins to emerge, as the entire state machinery, as well as land being divided up, libraries, museums, bits of the civil service, the army, the police, all of it has to be divided. This is a photograph staged, but to represent something that actually happened, which was the division of libraries. Famously, India ended up with A to J of many dictionaries and Encyclopedia Britannicas, whilst K to Z ended up in all the Pakistani libraries. But perhaps most heinously was the fate of the Mohenjo-Daro necklace. This was one of the great masterpieces of the ancient world. It was a beautiful golden thread with beads made from lapis lazuli and jade and agate, all of these stones that were not from the subcontinent, but in a sense represented the trade of ancient India with the rest of the ancient world, with the pharaohs of Egypt, with the kings of ancient Mesopotamia, with the people of Afghanistan at the time. This was 4,500 years ago. It's a beautiful necklace, and unsure of who would get this necklace, the bureaucrats are given about 10 minutes. They were in such a rush that they're given about 10 minutes to decide what to happen to it. They decide to snip the necklace in half and give an equal number of beads to India and an equal number of beads to Pakistan. One of the tragedies I always find is that you can see the remains of this necklace in both the museums of Delhi and Karachi, and no one stops to look at these beads that are just piled in a heap. No longer part of one of the great masterpieces of the ancient world, but just a pile of stones that no one stops to look at. Amidst this bureaucratic nightmare emerges the largest forced migration in human history. As I mentioned before, 12 to 15 million people displaced, and about 1 to 3 million deaths in the course of a single year. Now, this migration is with us every day. I think that we often forget that so many of the South Asian communities that now live outside of the subcontinent have their origins in partition. Take Britain, for example. The South Asian communities that live in Britain are not representative of the subcontinent. You mostly have in Britain Punjabis, Bengalis, Kashmiris, Gujaratis. These are not necessarily representative of the subcontinent's, diverse communities. These are, however, representative of the communities that were displaced during partition. And it's a migration where, growing up in Delhi, virtually every single one of my friends had a partition story. It continues to shape how people see where they belong, and it's, the central event of 20th century South Asian, it's the 20th century world history, one of. And, So the fourth partition that I want to talk to you about is what happened to those princely states, those 565 states that were not directly ruled by Britain, but were semi-autonomous, and which until this point, it had been more or less assumed that they would become independent after the British departed from the subcontinent. One second. So we often think of the borders of South Asia being the result of kind of British divide and rule and of a British bureaucrat drawing the entire thing with a pen. Actually, the British bureaucrat Cyril Radcliffe did divide up British India, those 2/3 of the subcontinent that were under direct rule. This is the map that he essentially drew. The bits in dark grey are Pakistan on its Independence Day, and light grey is India. As you can see, they look nothing like their respective countries do today. These are the 565 princely states who had to be divided between them in order to make the modern map. These states were each given the option of remaining independent, joining India, or joining Pakistan. And the decisions of these Maharajas, Sheikhs, and Nawabs would not necessarily follow along religious lines in the same way as British ruled India would. It was also responsible for the drawing of about 80% of the modern border, which roughly runs in the middle of these states, and of course now carves Kashmir in half. These are the princes, painted shortly before this event, and I think they look absolutely dapper. I'm particularly a fan of this guy's hat. I think that's the Maharaja of Baroda. Here's the Nizam of Hyderabad in the center, and Maharaja of Udaipur, the lake city, with the spectacular beard that you see there. Now, emerging from this partition of the princes, there are three major conflicts that would emerge, three major conflicts that would continue, two of which continue to shape the world today. The first of these is Hyderabad. Hyderabad was the largest princely state. There it is, the big red one in the middle. And it was ruled by the richest man in the world. It was Hindu majority, and it had a Muslim ruler. And he was so confident of his future that he declared he was going to remain independent. After all, he had an army, he had his own currency, and increasingly issued his people with passports. So I've actually managed to get a map since the publication of this book. Someone showed me a map which actually displays Hyderabad as independent, because it remains independent for almost a year after partition, after independence. But it was incredibly feudal, and in the following year, you get the emergence of a communist revolution in the countryside. In order to put it down, the Nizam, the ruler, begins leaning upon a kind of militant Islamist group called the Razakars, who, in addition to putting down the communist rebellion, increasingly just targeted random Hindus and religious minorities in the countryside anyway. And by September 1948, the Indian army essentially invades. It's a separate country, recognized by several other states. And what's known as the police action happens, where Indian army tanks and planes roll in. And there's a line by one of the generals of Hyderabad saying that when the Mughals tried to conquer us, Hyderabad put up a fight for about 6 months. In our case, we managed to only put up a fight for 6 days. Now, you chat to people from the subcontinent today, and there's often this assumption that the partition never affected South India. Nothing could be further from the truth. There are 3 times more refugees generated from this event, the annexation of Hyderabad, than were generated from the Palestinian Nakba the same year. So it's huge civilian casualties, huge displacement, and an event that's not widely known about enough. Now, another of the conflicts that would emerge from the disputed nature of these princely states would be the conflict over Balochistan, which continues to plague southwestern Pakistan. This is Balochistan. It is a dry, arid region on the border of Iran and overlooking the sea towards the Gulf. It was a constitutional monarchy. So there was a Khan known as the Khan of Kalat who ruled, but he also had a parliament. And this parliament put it to a vote. Are we going to join Pakistan or are we going to remain independent? And they all decided we're going to remain independent. But later the Khan is pressured into acceding to Pakistan. And so begins this dispute over the status of Balochistan. Should it be independent, as the parliament said it should, or did the ultimate right to choose what happened to the state lie in the hands of the royalty, of the monarch? And so there, it's a fight over the status of did the monarch get to decide, basically. By far the largest conflict, though, that has emerged is the conflict over Kashmir, the northernmost princely state in the subcontinent. If I go back to that map, Balochistan is the big blue one over here, and Kashmir is the red one at the top over here. So the story in Kashmir is simple. It's a Muslim-majority region ruled over by a Hindu Maharaja. Again, a kind of diverse population of people where, arbitrary divisions of, one religion should go here and another religion should go here don't necessarily make sense. The Maharaja initially tries to remain independent. He says that he wants it to be a Switzerland of the East. But it borders Punjab, which is where the worst partition violence was, where the worst massacres took place during India's partition. And as this violence sweeps into the plains of southern Kashmir, the Muslims of a city called Jammu are massacred by a mob. Now, rumors go round, probably unfounded, that the Maharaja, the Hindu Maharaja, had something to do with letting these mobs into the state. And so a group of Pakistani military men go behind the back of Pakistan's founder, Jinnah, and begin sponsoring a tribal militia known as the Lashkar to go and capture Kashmir for Pakistan, for the Muslim-majority state. This Lashkar would be the first time of many that Pakistan's military goes behind the back of the civilian government in order to organize cross-border funding of militias. And anyway, but their invasion does the opposite effect to what was intended. Whilst it was intended to capture Kashmir for Pakistan, it pushes the Maharaja of Kashmir to accede to India instead. And within a few months, you have suddenly the Indian army and the Pakistani army both drawn into the region and fighting the first of many wars over this former princely state. The ceasefire line in 1949 has roughly remained the same ever since, and it now divides the state in two. Half the state is ruled by Pakistan, half is ruled by India, and today China actually administers a third of it, thanks to later events. But Kashmir would subsequently develop into one of the most militarized regions on planet Earth. I think it's important to remember that India and Pakistan both continue to claim the entire state. So on any Indian map, this whole region, which had never been under the government of India, an independent India since its birth, is all claimed by India. And likewise, Pakistan, which has never governed the whole region in its entirety, continues to claim the entire region for Pakistan. And of course, the people who suffer are the Kashmiris, who are caught in the middle. There have been, I think, 5 or 6 wars fought over Kashmir in the last 75 years. And in 2000, Bill Clinton called it one of the most dangerous places on Earth, this being the former holiday resort of the Raj, the beautiful area full of mountains and lakes. Now, by 1950, the map of South Asia that we see today was more or less in place. The borders that we see today had more or less emerged, with one key exception, and that is the borders of Bangladesh. Because Bangladesh in 1950 was still a part of Pakistan. When Pakistan was carved out from India in 1947, the idea was that any Muslim majority region goes to Pakistan. And Pakistan, and there had been Muslim majorities in the east and west of the country. So there was an East and West Pakistan. And although, with hindsight, we know that the country will break up, and so we often assume, I think, that it was always destined to do so, in the early days, there was a good amount of hope that these two disparate regions would be able to unite into a single nation. Four of the first 8 prime ministers of Pakistan actually come from what's now Bangladesh. This is the first Bengali prime minister, Khwaja Nazimuddin, and early coins from Pakistan have both the Urdu script of modern Pakistan as well as the Bengali script of modern Bangladesh. But everything would change when the Pakistani military takes over in the 1960s. Pakistan's army had continued the British colonial institution of only allowing what were known as martial races into the army. And what this meant was that the Brits had decided that Punjabis were martial, so something ridiculous like 40% of the army would come from Punjab. I think by the 1950s, 1% of the Pakistani army came from the Eastern Province. So when the army takes over, it suddenly means that there is no political representation of the Eastern Province in the military junta. This man, Mujibur Rahman, he's called, would begin campaigning for increased autonomy of the Eastern Province, and increasingly hinting that if it wasn't given, he might seek outright secession. There are all sorts of dubious links between him and Indian secret intelligence, which convinced Pakistan's military leadership that he was a plant, that his aim was always to break up Pakistan. It doesn't seem to be the case, but he certainly did have ties across the border. What is clear is that when he wins the first democratic elections ever held in Pakistan in 1970, the military refuses to hand over power to him. And instead, they round him up, they round up several of his political colleagues, and they massacre many of his political supporters. In Dhaka University, the tanks roll in and basically shoot and line up students who had supported his political party. Increasingly, people fleeing the army flock around the banner of an army known as the Mukti Bahani, the Liberation Army for Bangladesh, and this is one of their political posters, incredible poster inspired by the artwork of the Bengali artist Jamini Roy. And the death toll of this conflict remain uncertain, but we do know that somewhere in the league of 10 million refugees flee into India in the course of 9 months. That's 1/12 the total population of Pakistan. It's one of the most bloody conflicts of the 20th century, and it would completely reshape the map, the geopolitical map of South Asia. Many of you will know the rock concert put on by George Harrison, Eric Clapton, Ringo Starr, and Bob Dylan, along with Ravi Shankar, in honor of raising awareness about this conflict, the concert for Bangladesh, which was the precursor to Live Aid and probably popularized the term Bangladesh in the Western imagination for the first time. Fewer people know that in the conflict that followed, that December, saw probably the closest that South Asia got to nuclear war. Pakistan was at the time allied with the Nixon administration in the US. India increasingly leaned towards the USSR. And the US, to support Pakistan, would send in a nuclear fleet, which were then trailed by USSR submarines. So this thing almost went nuclear. But in December, India forces a Pakistani surrender and helps in the emergence of a new country called Bangladesh, the 12th nation state to emerge from what was once one British colony, the Indian Empire. So today you look at the news around us and it's constantly headlines like this: India and Pakistan, the nuclear standoff that we should all be worried about. This one was particularly awful. If Indians and Pakistanis can relocate, why can't Gazans? As if this had been a resounding policy success on behalf of Britain's administration. And then I just think that it's important to remember, standing here in Dublin, that much of both of those conflicts, the partition of India and Pakistan and the partition of Israel and Palestine, were both done by similar colonial bureaucrats who had been involved in the partition of Ireland. Ireland was very much in the back of their minds. If you read all of the documents, they talk about worrying about creating little Ulsters. The precedent for a partition along religious lines is forged here. And I think it's just amazing in Ireland how much it shows how these, the furies of partition have been alleviated in recent years since the Good Friday Agreement. Until the 90s, there was just as much conflict in Northern Ireland, and today it's extraordinary just how much has changed. I first came to this subject with my college friends, Sparsh here, who's an Indian Australian whose family migrated from what's now Pakistan, and my friends Sadia and Amina from Pakistan, but whose family came from what came from India. And we had this conversation in Oxford in the UK that it was strange that we could only meet here in India's former colonizers' country, essentially, rather than actually being able to meet in the subcontinent itself. So we worked on reconnecting families that had been divided by the partition, using virtual reality to transport people across the border to their old homes, their old communities, try to track down old friends that they hadn't seen in 75 years. So here is a picture of one of the people we took back virtually to his old home. And I think it's extraordinary that this population still survives today, who remember a time before any of these borders existed. In this recent conflict in April, we had Trump saying that India and Pakistan have been fighting over Kashmir for thousands of years. And the truth is that there are people that I've spoken to this year who remember a time before the border had even been drawn. And so, I'd like to just leave on that moment of hope, in a sense, that it's extraordinary what can be done with communication, with cross-border peace programs. It's not these aren't ancient conflicts that go back to the dawn of time. These are conflicts which have been forged within living memory and that we can still hope to heal someday. Thank you so much for being an amazing audience. Thank you.